Hello and welcome to Scotland 2016. Nigel Farage says a vote to leave the EU would bring more powers to Holyrood. But is anyone here listening to the European debate? And we've got a sneak preview of one of the UK's biggest celebrations of contemporary art. It's been slow taking off in Scotland, overshadowed inevitably by the Holyrood election campaign. But are there hints? Finally, the EU referendum debate is heating up here. Earlier tonight, Nigel Farage was in Glasgow, arguing that a Brexit vote would lead to more powers for the Scottish Parliament. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has defended his government's pro-EU leaflet amid claims that £9 million of public money is being spent on one-sided propaganda. Here's our political correspondent, Nick Eardley.
I make no apology for the fact that we have, we are sending to every household in the country this leaflet, which sets out...
Ready for delivery. Arguments on our future in the EU coming to a home near you soon. Vote Leave launched its campaign in Scotland earlier this week. They chose the world's largest hydraulic components distributor, where the owner thinks life outside the EU would mean better trade tariffs with South America. The campaign's director north of the border focused his argument on powers and education.
Things like fishing and agriculture, which are currently run from Brussels, will have to come to Holyrood, not to Westminster, because those are not reserved issues. If we come out of the EU, then EU students will continue to be welcome to study in Scotland, but they'll have to pay tuition fees, and we will be able to give precedence to Scottish students.
Vote Leave are competing with another group to be the official voice of the Brexit campaign. Grassroots Out were in town tonight, hosting a rally at Glasgow University. Not everyone was happy to see them. After protesters briefly had their voice heard, it was back to the Leave arguments.
There's a broad range of voices at the event here tonight, from trade unionists to former Conservative cabinet members. They acknowledge that the Holyrood campaign is dominating politics in Scotland at the moment, but they also argue that the EU question is vitally important for the UK's future.
We had to get the political establishment to the point of total nervous breakdown and panic to even give us this referendum. And only then did it happen, because surprisingly the Tories got a majority. I suspect if we vote to remain, we may never get the chance again.
So it's an important vote that people need to be thinking about.
Constitutionally, this is the most important question people will answer probably in their lifetimes.
June the 23rd, make sure you vote. It is your voice.
The Prime Minister also says this vote is crucial.
Thank you very much.
The government will spend £9 million setting out its case in a leaflet sent to every household. Leave campaigners are furious, but the PM says it's money well spent.
We're not neutral in this. We think it would be a bad decision to leave. We think it would be bad for our economy, bad for jobs, bad for investment, bad for families' finances. We think it would be bad for universities. We're not neutral. So we've made a clear stance in this leaflet, which I hope everyone will get a copy of at their home.
And the trouble is, the In campaign here in Scotland agrees it's fair for the government to set out its vision. But they take issue with the future Leave campaigners say is on offer outside the EU.
The trouble with the prospectus to leave is there's no white paper, there's no blueprint behind it. If people had an option that looked rosy, they might take it. But our view is that Europe has done incredibly well for us, and we've done incredibly well for Europe. It's part of who we are.
The EU debate may remain in the background until the 5th of May. But these guys want your vote, and you can expect to see them flying the flag in the weeks to come.
Well, you saw them both there in Nick's report. Here with me from the Scotland Stronger In campaign is John Edward, and from Scottish Vote Leave is Tom Harris. Good evening to both of you. Tom Harris, Nigel Farage was here today arguing that a Brexit vote would deliver more powers to Holyrood, more money to Holyrood. Same argument as you. Why aren't you campaigning alongside him?
There are a number of different campaigns. At some point in the next week, the Electoral Commission will make a decision about who's the official campaign, and until that happens, people are perfectly free to campaign how they like. There might be a different emphasis between the different campaigns, but essentially we're working towards the same goal, which is Scotland and a UK outside the EU.
And you're a former Labour MP, though, and you're not part of the Labour Leave campaign. Why not?
Well, Labour Leave is complicated. Labour Leave is actually part of Vote Leave. It's part of the umbrella organisation of Vote Leave.
If it's complicated and confusing, though, don't you think that's a bit confusing for the public, trying to get your message across?
No, not at all, because we're not asking people to analyse or memorise the list of different organisations. We're asking people to listen to the arguments that we're making, and the arguments we're making, I think, will have a lot of resonance between now and the 23rd of June. Well,
John Edward, the argument that a Brexit vote would actually bring more powers, more money to Holyrood. Are you not concerned that that's actually going to be quite a persuasive argument here in Scotland?
Not really. It's a very strange roundabout way of devolving more powers to the Scottish Parliament. We've had processes before, like the Calman Commission and the Smith Commission, that over months and years have talked about the detailed aspects of devolving power. I think pulling ourselves out of the most successful trade bloc and a community we've been part of for the last 45 years simply to try and seek to move some powers back to the Scottish Parliament is not the way to do devolution.
Well, it is a bit of a strange way, is it not, of arguing for more powers for Holyrood?
What we're pointing out is the simple legal fact that if the UK came out of the EU, the powers that the EU currently wield over Scotland would have to go somewhere, and if they're not listed as reserved matters in the Scotland Act, they would come to Holyrood. But there are more positive reasons for coming out of the EU. First of all, the huge amount of money that you and I pay as taxpayers for the privilege of being members of the EU. There is the whole knock-on effect that I mentioned in that video. Most people in Scotland don't realise that when they pay their taxes to fund free tuition in Scotland, they're paying for free tuition for EU students as well. Now, if EU students, who are always going to be welcome in Scotland to study, if they actually paid their way, that'd be a huge financial boost for universities, but we can't do that while we're members of the EU.
Well, what about that huge financial windfall that Tom Harris talks about?
Well, this assumes that the gross amount of money that goes out of the country to the EU is somehow lost to us permanently into a vacuum of 27 other countries.
But on that specific argument, for example, about the tuition fees?
Well, it works both ways. I mean, there's lots of Scottish students who go and study overseas and they get preferential treatment in EU universities because they are EU students as well. That's the point of being in a community where you have equal rights and equal protection. But the idea that somehow the money that we send out has no impact back in Scotland. It wasn't our figures or indeed the other side's figures. An independent body came up with the idea that roughly for every pound that we spend in the EU, we get £10 back, because in the investment in the different forms of research and innovation, never mind all the grants like structural funds.
What do you say about that?
It is just not true. There was the biggest survey, for example, let's talk about trade tariffs. The biggest survey of trade tariffs in 2013 showed that even outside the EU, with British companies having to pay tariffs, the amount of tariffs they'd pay would be dwarfed by the amount of money we would save by not paying money to the EU. You know, when in a time of austerity, we are paying for infrastructure projects in Greece. Now, actually, I think that money would be better spent in Scotland and in Britain. And I think once that message goes out to the people of Scotland, I think that's something they're going to listen to when we're talking about cuts to frontline services, but we're still giving money to an unaccountable, non-transparent bureaucracy in Brussels.
Well, it could be quite a compelling anti-austerity argument.
If it had any sense behind it. But the point is, the money isn't going off into a black hole. The money is going out to be invested back into the countries, including our own. It's a bit like saying we all pay income tax or council tax, and that's the last we see of it. And because I only get my bins taken out once a month, then I need to get my money back. That the money goes into projects that the member states put together themselves, that the universities put together themselves, that companies put together themselves, and that's where it's invested. We're not the biggest. We're not the biggest net contributor, and of course we got a large rebate, and nobody's talked about that either. The fact is that Britain negotiated a large rebate out of the system. So the money, yes, of course we spend a bit of money, but if you look at the back of your tax form every year, there are great big wedges there of social security and defence and health and everything else. The EU is a tiny sliver in the middle. It's a tiny sliver of less than 2%. So we're talking about as if somehow there's this huge cash crowd there that's going to somehow save the world. But actually this money has a big effect, and it has a multiplier effect and a match funding effect that nobody ever talks about.
It certainly has a big effect in other EU countries. There's no doubt about that.
As it has in the Highlands and Islands.
But the headline figure that Scots are paying to the EU is £1.5 billion a year. That's more than half of our total education budget. Now, it may be a sliver of money in the EU finances, but for Scotland, it's a huge amount of
not in the EU finances.
Tom Harris, isn't one of the problems you've got in presenting the argument to leave, it's not like the Scottish independence referendum where there was a white paper, as John Edwards said, in the package. You can't actually say with any certainty what a Scotland outside the EU would look like.
Well, remember the criticism that the SNP and the Yes campaign got for producing that white paper, because it was immediately criticised because it was hypothetical. Now, the fact is that remaining in the EU has its own uncertainties. For example, John won't be able to tell us how much of that, it's £350 million a week at the moment we're paying. We don't know how much more than that will be if we stay in the EU in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. We don't know what the next intergovernmental conference that brings us the next treaty change. We don't know what restrictions and regulations that will impose on the UK. There are an awful lot of uncertainties if we stay in the EU.
So there are uncertainties on both sides.
There's a lot of uncertainties in life. I don't know what my income tax rate will be in 5 years' time, but the one thing you know about an intergovernmental conference or the EU system is if we veto it, it won't happen. And this is what everyone seems to forget, is that this is not a union out there doing stuff to us. We're part of this system. We're a big, powerful part of this system. And if we choose to exercise our power within that, we can get what we want. The idea that somehow things are going to come our way that we have no control over in one of these conferences and that we're just going to sit back and let it happen, it just is a very supine and passive way of looking at politics.
Tom Harris, do you think actually that Scottish voters are in any way engaged in this debate yet, or is it being completely overshadowed by the Holyrood elections?
I think it is being overshadowed by Holyrood, and I think that's probably right at the moment. These are important Scottish Parliament elections. The problem in Scotland is that for the last decades, whenever we talk about constitutional reform, it's always been about one thing. It's been about Scottish independence. So we've never really had an audience for the debate on Europe. After we vote on May the 5th, we'll have 6 weeks to have a really intense, I hope positive debate about the EU. But I hope we don't just say, well, just because the political elites and the establishment want the EU, therefore we must vote for it. There's something wrong if the elites and the political establishment want it. That should raise a warning bell with a lot of people.
John Edward, do you think that the Scottish people will start to take an interest in this?
Because we're going to be talking about why it affects them. I've got no interest in the political establishment. We haven't got any politicians near 100 miles of our platforms. What we're talking about is what difference it makes to people's lives as workers, as students, as pensioners and whoever. That's the kind of stuff that matters.
John Edward, Tom Harris, thanks for coming in this evening.